I've been working on a design for a garden shed slash trash enclosure, and I need this because despite the fact that I have a really large garage, the gardening tools are always in the way. So I'm gonna put those outside, and the trash bin, the recycling bin, and the compost bin, whenever the wind picks up, they get blown halfway across the alley.
Run away, Justin! Oh crap, I'm gonna hit Christina's car!
So I'm going to secure those as well. The design is a lean-to shelter with a raised retaining wall so that the bins are on the same level as the alley. I already have a concrete pad, and Ashley and I built the retaining wall last summer in anticipation of this project. So we're in good shape there. It's just I need to stop procrastinating because it's no longer summer, it's fall now, and the Seattle rain, it's coming. When we built the retaining wall last summer, we built it with the expectation of actually putting a shed on there. But over time, it's shifted out of square. So I'm gonna have to dig out all the gravel behind it so that I can square it up for the foundation. Both the retaining wall and the foundation are made from in-sized pressure-treated lumber, and this is rated for ground contact. There's two different types of pressure treat. Some is ground contact, some is appearance grade. The in-sizing refers to the little dents all over it, and that allows the machines, when they make the pressure treat, to get the pressure-treated liquid deeper inside of the wood, but it does not penetrate the wood completely. So I like to add this wood preservative onto all of the cut ends of any pressure treat that I'm using. I find that it makes the project last a whole lot longer. With all the foundation parts cut out, it's pretty quick to just assemble it with a nail gun. I'm setting up the corners first, and then I can go in with the cross bracing, which I just ended up putting 2 in there. I think the rule of thumb is about 24-inch spacing. I'm using 3/4-inch plywood on top, so this should be plenty of support. I quickly check to make sure that the structure is square. You can do that by measuring corner to corner. If those two measurements match up, then it is square. If they're out of square, you can kind of shove a corner in or out a bit to make sure that those measurements are exactly the same. With the foundation slid into place, I popped in a 3/4-inch shim on the side. This is gonna allow enough space for the sheathing later, and then I can start leveling everything out. I just use whatever shims I have on hand and get it so that it's level in all directions. And once I have that, I can start cutting blocks to go in there. I just take another piece of pressure treat and strike a line on top of it, and then I can take it over my chop saw, chop it down, and I just repeat this over and over again throughout the whole foundation. To prevent any critters from making a home underneath this foundation, and also to weigh it down and allow for plenty of drainage, I found some extra pavers and some gravel and used them to fill it up. For all the plywood on this build, I'm using 3/4-inch CDX plywood. This is outdoor rated. It's tongue and groove, which isn't important for the decking, but it is important for all the sheathing and the roofing. So I just decided to buy exactly the same stuff so I didn't have to worry about it. With the foundation complete, I can start building the walls. And I'm gonna build these sort of one at a time. I'm gonna start with the front wall that has the door in it. So I've got a frame up with a header, and I also am trying to be mindful of how the whole thing is assembled together. Make sure I've got plenty nailing surface for the side walls to nail into. So what I'm doing here is I'm stacking up some 1/2-inch plywood in between two 2x4s, and what that does is it allows the 2x4 to be exactly the same size as a 2x4 on its side, which will make it easier to nail up later. The front wall is made up of 2 framed out sections with a header on top. The door will be centered in between those 2, so they're exactly the same, and I just cut a bunch of 2x4s the same size and then just made it twice. The header is made from a 2x6, and this is just doubled up, so I need to cut 2 at the exact same size. It's also going to need to be sandwiched with a piece of 1/2-inch plywood. Again, for the same reason, it needs to be dimensionally the same as the side of a 2x4. So this is easy to do. I just load it with nails from both sides. Basically functions as a solid piece of wood without the expense of buying something that big. I'm not going to nail this wall together just yet, just because it's really awkward to move around without damaging it, but I am going to set it up because I need to take some measurements off of it and get prepared to set up for the side walls. I did build this entire structure in SketchUp, and so I technically have all the measurements, but I've found that when you're building like this, it's a lot faster to build just referencing off of the sizes that you already have. So I know the pitch of the roof is going to be a 12/4 pitch, and I know the heights that I'm trying to hit with my door and the size of my window. So as long as I know that, I can pretty well determine the spacing and everything just on the fly, and that way I'm not looking at a SketchUp model over and over again as I build. Speaking of roof pitch, I'm setting my pitch at 4/12, which is the same as my house, and that comes out to an 18.5 degree angle. I don't really trust my chop saw to be perfectly accurate, so I double checked on my Speed Square. Speed Square has reference lines for the different pitches of roofs. If you want to learn more about that, there's a whole video that I watched just to learn about it, and I'll post a link down below. So I cut a couple angles out of some scrap, and then I could make a mark at the top of the header where that ends up. And from there, I can cut an extra long stud just with the 18.5 degree angle on one end, line it up with that mark, and then mark it out at the base plate of the front wall. And that's my mark to cut it to length. As I make one wall, I'm also cutting all the studs for the opposing wall as well, because I've got the saw set up exactly the same way, so it might as well make both walls at the same time. So the base plate for this is the measurement that I took earlier on the surface of the foundation. Now I'm setting in another 2x4 here, measuring in between the 2 studs, and then I can cut down sort of a couple of spacer pieces. So one of the tricks to make sure that these big walls are square is called the 3-4-5 rule. It's following, if you remember geometry class, the Pythagorean theorem. So a side that is 3 foot and a side that is 4 foot will be at 90 degrees when the hypotenuse is 5 foot. So that's what I'm measuring out here. And once it's at that 5 mark, I can strike a line and I know it's square. With one corner square, I can start framing up my roof pitch, and I cut a piece that was longer than I needed and another piece also longer than I needed with angles on one end, and then I can use those 2 pieces to connect the dots basically. And then I can cut that down. Again, this is all that 18.5 degree angle. It doesn't change up at all. It just stays consistent throughout the build. And then once I've got all those cut to the right length, I can just nail it all together. So if you remember earlier when I put that piece of 3/4 inch plywood in between the foundation and the retaining wall, that was for this piece of sheathing. This needs to go on now before I install the wall because I won't have access to nail it off later because it actually sits a little bit below the retaining wall. So I cut this out, I cut a little notch for the back side of the retaining wall, and then I can attach it to the actual wall itself. And for that, I'm using a 3/4 inch spacer on the bottom to make sure it overhangs a little bit. That's gonna help for rain. If rain falls on this, it'll drain away. It won't kind of run into the actual building. Now I can nail that panel onto the wall, and then off camera, I also stapled on some tar paper so that I have a bit of a moisture barrier because once again, I'm not gonna have access to this panel later. Once the first wall's in, things just kind of slot into place from there. The one thing that I'm making sure of as I go is that things stay nice and plumb, especially the door side. If that's not plumb, the door will sort of open or close on its own, and I really don't want that. This is a really fun stage of the build because you're building a building. I mean, it's awesome, and you get to see it take shape in front of your eyes. Well, you build all these individual parts, and then all of a sudden, it's an enclosure. It's super cool. So you can see I just left the header off for a little bit, and then I can slip it into place and nail it in from underneath and from the back side. The walls are still pretty shaky at this stage, and every time I add another wall or another panel, it's gonna get stronger and stronger up until the point where I actually get the roof on, and that'll tie the whole structure together. For the back wall, I'm just making it out of some doubled up 2x4 studs on either end, and then filling with 16-inch on center studs in the middle. There's also a space at the top for another header, and that you'll see in a little bit is gonna support the rest of the roof. For the header, I'm using a big 12-foot 2x6. This is the appearance grade pressure treat, so it looks a little bit nicer than that ground contact stuff. And I need to laminate another 2x6 on the back side of it, just so that everything meets up right on the shed itself. But once it kind of extends over the trash cans, it'll just be that one 12-foot 2x6 that you'll see. I wasn't really sure if it was going to be level or not. I really had no idea, but I think I just lucked out on this one because it was pretty much dead level. I didn't have to do much to it. To support that cantilevered end, I needed to set in a 4x4 post. And so I picked up some of these strong ties. They're like base plates for 4x4s, and that supported it on the bottom. But in order to do it on the top, I wanted something that kind of looked a little bit better. So I decided to notch the beam into the 2x6. I started by cutting the 4x4 to height, and then I took it over to the circular saw and I just set it to the same depth as a 2x6. And then made a whole bunch of cuts. By making a bunch of cuts, you break up the strength of the wood grain, and so you can just knock it out with a hammer and clean it up with a chisel. To support the roof on the other side, I'm gonna need to put a 4x4 post right up against the sheathing, and in order to do that, I need the sheathing to be there already. So I decided to finish off this wall. And in order to do that, I had to cut out a notch for that header that I just put in. So I set it into place and made my mark, and then I forgot to hold on to it. And I almost died. When I posted about this build on Instagram, I got a bunch of questions about why I was using tar paper instead of Tyvek on the outside of the building. It's mostly because I had it laying around. This is what people used to use before Tyvek. It works fine, and especially for a shed, you don't really need that much of a moisture barrier. It's an uninsulated space, but I figured I'd err on the side of caution and add it in. I'm also going to be putting shake shingles over the top of it, and it'll be a nice sort of breathable, semi-permeable layer underneath. I'm folding it into the window. I don't know if this is all that necessary. This window is not going to get much moisture because it's going to be underneath the roof, but I figured since I was here, I might as well do a halfway decent job of wrapping up this window and folding the tar paper into the actual sill. The plywood wasn't quite tall enough to reach the top of the building, so fortunately with the tongue and groove, you can just kind of clip a little piece into place, and then I can go over and add the tar paper. You want the tar paper to overlap itself from above so that if rain does get behind there, it rolls down to the next layer. You don't want to stack it the opposite way, stacking it from the top to the bottom. It's always best to go from the bottom up. To prep for that post, I'm just striking a plumb line and then adding in my bottom plate along that line. Then once I bring in the 4x4, I know exactly where to line it up. I'm notching out this 4x4 exactly the same way as I did the other one. The only difference is that this is only going to support a 2x4 above it because I'm going to have 3 of these posts. I don't have nearly as wide of a span as on the other side, and I just figured a 2x4 was plenty. I don't know if this was necessary, but it was just a little bit of peace of mind. I added in some structural anchors from the opposite side, just 3 of them, to hold that 4x4 post in place. So to support the 2x4 that goes across while I figure out all the measurements and stuff, I just screwed in a regular 2x4 stud vertically, and then I can clamp that into place, figure out what's level, and then I can set up for my next post, which again, I notched out in the same way. As the sun was starting to set, I was going to put in the 3rd middle post, and I put the plate down, but when I went to look at the post that was delivered to me from the lumber yard, I found that there was a huge crack all the way through it. So I didn't really want to use that. They were super nice. I returned it the next day, but it wasn't going to work out for that night. So the next morning, I came back and started working on the sheathing. So this shed it's a little bit bigger than 48 inches, so I ended up having to splice together one piece on this back side. Main thing was that I just made sure it was lined up with a stud so that I can nail both sides into that stud. And once again, I had to add that little extra bit at the top, but I made sure that the tongue and groove lined up, so it was really strong. Since I had that pit already dug behind the shed, I decided to add in a little bit of tar paper just in case some water wanted to seep through the retaining wall, and then I filled it up with all that stone that I pulled out before. The back wall is the same width all the way up, so it was just easy to cut through 2 sheets of plywood this time, get exactly the same cut so that they stack up real nice. On the front side, I just used all the scraps that I had remaining to build that. Fortunately, I was able to keep the tongue and groove for these top sections, and so it's nice and sturdy. I don't have to put any blocking in behind it. That afternoon, I ran back to the lumber yard and picked up a new 4x4 post. A big thanks to Dunn Lumber. They're not sponsoring or anything, but they were super nice through this whole process. They delivered all the lumber and they exchanged this 4x4. No problem, no questions asked, and I really appreciate that. So the function of the middle support is not only to support the roof, but it's also to create a nice span between the fencing that I'm putting in. I'm putting fences between each of these sections, and I'm using just regular fencing plates to hold in a 2x4 to span across. Whenever I build fences, I like to build them with deck screws rather than nails because fences tend to get damaged over time or things rot out on them, and it's nice to be able to replace small sections as opposed to having to pry the whole thing apart and start over again. The fence is all made from cedar. These may look like normal 2x4s, but they're actually cedar 2x4s, and they just slip into place. One thing that I was conscious of was making sure that these were level. The base, the actual retaining wall, is not level, so I had to make sure that these ones were level so it visually looked right. To cover the top of the fencing, I'm using these caps, and it's another cedar 2x4 where I just cut an angle across the top of it, and that'll allow water to shed off of it rather than sitting on the surface and buckling the wood. The fence pickets are also made out of cedar. These are, picket cedar. It's not super well sanded or anything. It's just kind of a rough cedar. But I bought more than I needed. I eliminated the ones with heavy knots in them and tried to cut them out. I cut them to about 44 inches, and then I split half of them in half so that there's a little bit more visual interest to the fence itself, and you'll see how those lay out in a second. I tried to screw in the fence pickets without pilot holes, but of course it split, so I found I had to pre-drill everything before assembling. Once I got that done, it went really quick. I just stacked a 1/2-inch piece of plywood in between each of the pickets, and I had stacked them so there was one wide and then two thin and then one wide again, and just repeated that all the way around the fencing. As you can tell, it's starting to get dark and I'm running out of daylight, so real quick, I just attached a couple of extra pickets to the top and the bottom to cover up those screw holes, and I called it a night. The next step in this project is to start building the roof, and for that I'm just using regular 2x4s. I cut one end with that 18.5 degree angle, the same as my roof pitch, and then I can line it up with the headers on the structure itself, and then use my speed square to mark out where they interact with that rafter. So I'm going to be cutting some bird's mouths out of all these rafters. Bird's mouth is a notch that you cut out, and it'll lock into the structure. It's really nice and strong, and it's an easy way to set up your roof. So to cut a bird's mouth, I'm going to be adding that roof pitch angle to the front side and then square it up across the back. With the bed of the circular saw tilted to the roof pitch angle, I can then trim out the first cuts on both of the bird's mouths. Then with the circular saw tilted back to square, I can cut the other side of the notch. Now I'm not going to cut all the way through with the circular saw, so I can finish that off with a pull saw. Now this first 2x4 is really setting me up for a template. I want to make sure that if this fits right, and then if it does, I can use it to template a whole bunch more. I'm going to need 4 rafters cut like this, and then the rafters that go over the garbage area, those are going to be cut a little bit different. I checked across the entire roof line of the shed and made sure that it was lining up well, and since it was, I could batch out all 4 of those rafters. The other side of the roof is going to get 4 rafters as well, and for this one I just need to mark out these 2x6s. They're in a little bit of different spot from the other side, so I got to cut these a little different. This time I just used the jigsaw for it because I was getting tired of setting up the circular saw over and over again, and the jigsaw worked just fine. Since this rafter lined up perfectly with the one next to it, I just batched out 3 more, and then I stacked all the rafters up together so I can cut a notch out to put a 2x4 all the way across the roof. This is going to help square it up, make it a lot stronger, and again, this is just repeated cuts with the circular saw and then knocking it out with a hammer and cleaning it up with a chisel. One last little detail on the roof rafters is to add in a bit of bird blocking. This is just a chunk of wood that's going to go in between the 2 rafters above the shed because there's some gaps in there that animals could climb into. So I just add these in, cut them in the same angle. Again, it's 18.5 degrees, and then nail them off with some framing nails. Back side of the shed is a little bit taller, and honestly it barely stuck above the 2x4, so rather than cutting it on the table saw, I just knocked it back with the block plane. The last element before adding on the roof sheathing is the fascia board. I cut this at an angle and then set it into place, and again just screwed it into those roof rafters. This is also cedar. It's going to be more rot resistant than the 2x4 pine, as well as it just is going to look a lot better. The sheathing itself is super simple. It's all cut to the same size, and I just cut through 3 sheets of plywood in one go. After that, I can slide it up onto the roof, and I just start from one side, work my way over. The only tricky bit is making sure that you're lining up with the studs down below. You don't want a whole bunch of nails sticking out through your roof. So I used a T-square and squared up the studs, and then I just nailed it off. Sometimes the tongue and groove gives you a little bit of trouble and it doesn't want to fully seat. So what I do is I cut off a piece of scrap with the groove side on the end and then pound on it until it seats completely, and then I can go back and nail it. I had measured out the shed so that it was perfectly 12 feet, but unfortunately with the tongue and groove, the 48-inch boards get a little bit shorter. So I had to add a little section on the end, but it wasn't a big deal. I had plenty of material left, so I just cut a couple of grooved pieces and then nailed those into place. And it's amazing how much that roof firms up the structure. It was a little shaky before, and now it's not budging at all. So I'm going to save the rest of this for part 2. That's going to include framing the door, framing the window, shingling the roof, and then putting the cedar shake shingles on the siding. That's going to be a really fun build. I'm already into it at this point, and I think there's a lot of tips and tricks in there. So make sure you're subscribed. Make sure you hit that bell. If you're interested in seeing more outdoor projects, I've got a playlist right here. Oh, and also, if you're interested in plans for this build, let me know in the comments down below. I want to gauge interest levels there. Big thank you, as always, to the Patreon crew. Thanks so much. You are the best, and I will catch you on the next one.